Pierre has framed this as I'm going to talk to you about how humans navigate in space and what is the cognition behind that. And that is clearly something that we have done and keep doing in my research group. But it is only one of a larger portfolio of topics that we engage in at the interface between cognition, psychology, the human mind, what people do, and architectural design and urban planning. I will come back to this matter of how do people behave in space and the process by which people get from one point to another point in space clearly is interesting, both from a cognitive science, cognitive psychology point of view, but I think also of relevance for anybody who designs human scale built environments, because typically the way you perceive buildings, the way you perceive cities is not only bound to where you are right now and where you sit and look around, but a lot of our perception and engagement with architecture actually happens in motion. Funnily enough, in NSET set, there's a really nice contribution today about Lucius Burckhardt. Who of you knows Lucius Burckhardt? That's better than our turnout on Chomsky 4 weeks ago. Anybody wants to volunteer something about him? It's his 100th birthday this month, or this week even. What do you know about him?
He does these walks around places and tries to figure out the space while moving around it.
Yes. So Lucius Burckhardt invented this method of the Spaziergangswissenschaften, which I think also comes as Promenadologie. And his idea really was, well, he had lots of ideas. And he was an ETH professor for some time. Then he chose to go to Kassel and do more sociology and economics related work there. But in some sense, Lucius Burckhardt is really an outstanding example of scholarship. In NZZ, he's described as a Renaissance man after the Renaissance, partly because he actually spent 12 years of his life prior to engaging in his PhD and studying, I think, medicine and sociology and psychology, and got a degree in architecture and economics and stuff like that. And that is what he brought to the table. And in some level, I aspire for my team to do a similar thing. I didn't have 12 years to study. I specialized early on in psychology, but the team I am assembling to do the kind of work that we do is always interdisciplinary. And I'll talk about that right away. So I'm going to talk to you about architectural cognition, behavior, and experience in built spaces. And I'm hooking this onto the work that my team and I are doing as part of the Future Cities Laboratory, which I think I briefly mentioned in the first session as well. Future Cities Laboratory is an activity jointly run by ETH and the National Research Foundation of Singapore. It is an attempt to, well, investigate from different scientific angles the future of cities, both in Singapore and here in Zurich, and many of the professors that you are, I'm making the assumption again that most of you will be architecture students. Those of you who are not, don't take offense. Many of the professors that you are studying with probably are also part of Future Cities Laboratory. I am only going to be talking about work happening in one of the modules, Future Cities Laboratory, called Architectural Cognition and Practice. That's what we do. And it's a joint activity led by more senior people. Zdravko Trivic is an architecture professor and urban planner. Panos used to be postdoc in our team, now runs a group at Paris Telecom at the interface between human-computer interaction and architectural design. Leonel is a senior researcher in our team here in Zurich, and he's a data scientist. He basically does artificial intelligence applications. And then part of our team, wide-ranging backgrounds. Again, Lara is a designer that turned into a cognitive psychologist, neuroscientist throughout their studies. Yuchen and Freyan are both architects by training. Azrin is a neuroscientist and cognitive psychologist, graduated from University College London, and then chose to join us in the team in Singapore. And Raphael here is a PhD student with a computing background and a fellow at the AI Center of ETH. To position this even further, based on collaborations and a couple of alumni from my team, and now you might see a few familiar faces here from your fellow professors. We're working with them on design questions, but we're working with colleagues such as Michal Gat-Morat, who's now an assistant professor in Cambridge, or Luz Dalton at Northumbria University, really at this interface, bringing people in who have a foot in architecture, but also a foot in empirical research and in the behavioral sciences. And what we're looking at most of the time is more or less publicly accessible space where people spend different amounts of time, where people move through space, where they have certain tasks that they're trying to achieve. Those tasks can be tasks that are assigned to them, right? So if you work in an office environment, you might have a boss who tells you things, right? If you work in a hospital or if you're a patient in a hospital, you also have specific things that you might want to achieve. But also, and I think if we were to turn the light off here, probably the visibility would increase, right? You can find the button, that would be lovely. On the left-hand side here, you see a shopping mall. Singapore is an interesting place that is very much not Switzerland. If only for the climate situation where it's always hot and always humid. And so it's maybe understandable that a lot more of publicly accessible activity that in Switzerland or Europe would maybe be a bit more outdoors happens a lot indoors. And shopping malls are really a place where a lot happens, and a typical Singapore shopping mall is definitely bigger than Glattzentrum, and maybe also a bit more interesting and diverse. And what we do is we look at how do people perceive these spaces, what do they like or dislike about these spaces, do these spaces make the people nervous, what is their emotional response, what is their behavioral response, what is their cognitive response? Do they understand the logic of these spaces? Can they find the shop? Can they find the emergency ward in a hospital? Can they find the office where they're supposed to be going as a visitor for a meeting or whatever? I'm not going to go very deep into any of my case studies. You can always read that up if you want. I'm not going to bore you with more statistics than necessary. But I want to give you a few conceptual pointers about, so nice playing with the lights here. Excellent, thank you. About the conceptual ideas that we're trying to foster with the kind of research that we're doing that's spanning somehow from foundational research to reflective research. I'll explain in a minute what I mean with this, and applied studies, right? And the basic starting point of what we do is really simple. There's people who design spaces, there's spaces, and there's people who use spaces, who live in these spaces. We don't have a really good word for these people. They're people. If this was human-computer interaction, you would call them users. People in buildings can be inhabitants, they can be residents, they can be patrons, they can be employees. So a lot of the terminology that we use to talk about the people in the buildings depends on what their role is and what the role of that building is. But what people they have in common is that very often they engage in some purposeful activity. And this purposeful activity can also be sitting down on a bench with a cup of coffee, contemplating life, or doing a meditation exercise. You're still doing something purposeful, right? And so we're interested in how do people, users, live and use in buildings, and we're interested in building at different scales. So it could be, how do you use this room? Right now, we're using this room as me standing here and talking. There be an exit, just in case somebody needs to go out and wash their hands, right? You've chosen to sit here and listen to me and take notes, right? And potentially heeding the advice that Pierre has given on the nature of those notes. So this is what's happening down here, right? And when we talk about buildings, we can also talk about individual buildings. We can talk about ensembles of buildings or a housing estate or a neighborhood or anything urban if you like, right? So spatially, this can scale up or down from anything room size to anything that you as architects might want to design. Then there's designers. Somebody has to envision these spaces, right? We all know there's tons of other professions involved in making buildings happen. What we focus on a lot is designers, the people, the architects, who make all the decisions about how space should be arranged, what materials should be used, what surfaces, what arrangements of rooming dimensions, layouts of circulation spaces, relative positioning of buildings. All of these things might have an impact on this part here, right? So coming from an interest in this, via this, connecting to an interest in what the hell are these people thinking, right? And investigating those two components under this key term. Anticipation is, in my opinion, really the key element to discuss when we talk about human-centric evidence-based design, the role of the human perspective in architecture, biophilic architecture, all these buzzy words that are being used to talk about look at users, right? The idea is that in order for this person or these people here to make these buildings good for these people, you have to put yourself into the shoes of these people. And that is anticipation. And to some extent, of course, this is just a common sense task for the designer, because luckily we're all human and we all have some level of joint understanding of how spaces work, of purpose, etc. But at the same time, in some sense, designers are different than normal people. If only because you guys, again, making the assumption that most of you are architects in the room, you're probably on average better at spatial reasoning, at spatial visualization in your head of imagining spaces, memorizing spaces, seeing relations between spaces, having a sense of dimension and material and purpose and all that, right? So it might not be trivial to do this anticipation right. And there might be a discrepancy between what really happens here, and what's happening in the heads of the designers. And that basically is what our research is about. And this is where cognitive science, design, architectural cognition, and practice come together. And that's the purpose of what we do. Try to understand people. We also try to understand designers. But more importantly, we hope that the kind of work that we and other people in this really growing interdisciplinary field between behavior science and design, that this kind of research can inform design, and via that informing design, make better buildings for more happy people. I forgot to bring my favorite prop. Normally, I always bring a book edited by David Cantor about a conference that happened just before man landed on the moon in 1969. And in that book, all of these ideas are already present. And there was a phase in the 1970s into the 1980s where at really high-end universities like Berkeley, like ETH, like the AA in London and any other, you would have lots of behavior scientists, often psychologists, sociologists, come in either as adjunct lecturers or even as full professors to co-shape how architecture thought about all of these relations. For some reason or other, at some point in the 1980s, that completely went out of fashion, and these people aged and retired, and no new hires came along. There's a bit of a phase of not so much activity in this space. Interestingly enough, over the last 15 years, mostly last decade, there's a big resurgence of this topic under new terminology. Almost everything that's published there talks about neuroscience rather than about psychology, probably because neuroscience is, and I have no doubt about that, infinitely more sexy than psychology. And talking about the brain has the advantage that you try to capture something that is less subjective, that you're trying to make statements about how the building directly affects the human brain. Some of my colleagues do amazing research in that domain. Unfortunately, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm more interested in human behavior and the human mind and the brain. So we keep calling this architectural cognition. But if you go out and look at the kinds of activities that others do, and that's now promoted quite a bit, most of that is under the label of neuroscience for design, neuroscience for architecture, biophilic designs for humans, and all these kinds of things. And I hope that the kind of work that we do complements this neuroscience perspective. And ultimately, the aim is the same: happier people via better buildings. A bit more context, and then I promise I'll talk more about case studies. We basically try to combine three different approaches. One is fundamental research, looking at questions or methods of increasing scientific understanding of person-environment interactions, the stuff I defined on the previous slide, and the impact on cognition, on decision-making, on experience, how people perceive the world. Then there's reflective research. That's looking more at the designer side and not so much at the end user side of things. That's looking at considering how and how well designers conceptualize their end users. This notion of anticipation that I explored on the previous slide. And then there's translational research, which is working to equip design teams, going out, working with designers, and equip them with the knowledge and tools that makes them able to apply learnings from architectural cognition. I personally have been pushing for this for a long time, and I'm super happy to see that fully independent of my team's research, there is a strong interest growing again over the last decade or two in top-notch brand name architecture firms to establish not only research divisions, but research divisions that have a focus on this human-centric stuff. We're working with UN Studio in Amsterdam, with Foster & Partner in London, with 3XN in Copenhagen, with DP Architects in Singapore. They all have research divisions that employ behavior scientists, neuroscientists to do the kinds of things that I'm talking about. But they do it in a slightly different way from how you would do it in academia. In academia, we have time to do a proper study for a year, run enough observations, do fancy statistics, write a paper. And if it takes 2 years to get that published, we still get pat on the back from the president and he says, good work, kids. If you take 2 years for research in an architectural design practice or on a concrete project, you probably will be broke at the end of that process. So the kinds of things that you do in practice clearly happen at a different scale, with a bit more qualitative approach and digging less deep in terms of data and statistics, but still trying to capture the essence of what's the link between what humans do and how architecture affects. Okay, good. Take that as encouragement. Going through, getting closer to some examples. Really 3 pillars: fundamental research, right? How do people use and live in buildings? What do we know about the human environment relationship? And how do built spaces impact users? And how do we approach that? As Pierre said, a lot of the research that we do is about navigation, which is also called wayfinding. So about how do people get from A to B? How do they know how to not get lost in the train station or the airport or the hospital or ETH campus for that matter? We do a lot of work with what's called eye tracking. Eye tracking is a technique by which you allow people to behave in space, look at things and record what they're looking at and for how long they are looking at what objects. I'll show you a video of that in a minute. We engage in agent-based modeling. That is, we make computer programs that have lots of computer simulated people in it. It's a bit like in a video game, right? You have the player, the person who actively steers the game, but there's lots of non-player characters. And basically an agent-based simulation is generating lots of non-player characters, putting them in some spatial arrangement into an architectural space, and look what happens. For example, how do they navigate? How many of them get lost in the first 5 minutes? How many of them create congestion? Are there certain spaces where more people go and certain spaces where nobody goes? might be relevant for designing a transport hub, might be relevant for designing a museum, a library, any kind of such building. And we try to embed that in case studies, because it turns out coming up with a 10-point list of how to make great buildings doesn't really cut it. I mean, there are certain points that happen to be prominent on these 10-point lists, like if you can and you have to do a multi-floor building, maybe an atrium can help orient people, right? And it can also bring in more light. Having good visibility connections, having a clear hierarchy of how a space is structured, all that makes sense. But you guys are architects. You know that on some level, any architectural project, at least any capital A architecture project, is unique, right? So there will be some unique features that you can't just capture with principles, where you have to look into, okay, what are the concrete outcomes of certain design decisions, depending on the site, the target audience, the budget, the kind of decisions that you are making. I hate this animation. I should have done away with this animation. Well, you all know that there's different building processes that have an order. And for example, the RIBE architectural design process has all of these steps, right? From abstract strategic definition all the way to implementation and the post-occupancy phase of stuff being in use, right? Ideally, you would want to know everything about the human side the moment you do the strategic definition, right? That would be really handy. Unfortunately, that's typically not the case. The further down you go in the process, the more you learn and the more concrete you can measure about the human side of things. If the construction is completed, the building is handed over and it is in use, then you can do a set of techniques that are called post-occupancy evaluation. You can do real-world experiments. You can go into the existing space and observe how people behave. You can do interviews and ask, hey, how do you like this space? And tell me about your experiences. But it's a bit late to do anything about it, right? Post-occupancy kind of gives that away. In some cases, people do full-scale mock-ups of certain bits of a building, right? So for example, if you have a condominium and it has 100 units, as part of the preparatory process, you might build one of those units so that you have a showcase and that you can use it for selling it to people. And with that mock-up, you might also get some inspiration for how to do improvements on the next 100 units that you build in that condominium. Or other kinds of full-scale mock-ups that are oft used are if you have a patient room in a hospital and you will build 100 or 200 almost identical ones, then you often build one of them to scale, invite stakeholders like nurses and doctors and see, well, does this make sense? Does the patient bed fit in? Do all the doctors fit around the patient? Those kind of things. But it tends to be small scale and definitely not capital A architecture scale. Another thing that you can do, and you can do it early on when you have maybe a rough idea of the proportions and form and layout of the building, is you can do behavior experiments in virtual reality. So what you do, assuming that now everything is done with BIM anyway, and that you have a digital model at some level of granularity, you export that model into a video game engine. You give somebody a joystick, maybe a head-mounted set of glasses, right? And then you let them navigate through that building like in a video game. Well, technically, you're letting them navigate in a video game. And that can give you insights about which of the spaces appear to be spacious, which seem to be narrow, which seem to be inviting, which seem to be, I don't want to be there, right? You might give people tasks like, hey, this is the building. Where do you think the cafeteria would be? And have them navigate to find those spaces. There's also approaches where, and that can happen even further up, when you really only know something about basic spatial layouts, you might do different types of spatial analysis. Who of you has heard of space syntax? Only one person, two person, not so many. I think I have an illustration of that later. And then top of this would be agent-based simulations, where also in a very early design stage, you might want to do something about capacities and simulation of certain human factors in the computer based on fairly early design stages. This is the same, a bit more graphically illustrated, right? So this is an illustration of a typical wayfinding experiment in virtual environments. You would put somebody with these glasses, and then they would be able to navigate and experience a simulated space. Agent-based modeling, this is an example from an airport, Frankfurt Airport in Germany, where we compared agents that behave in an optimal fashion, because funnily enough, in the design of airports and in the capacity planning of airports, almost all of the agent-based simulation tools that are used to look at the planning of routes, the planning of capacities, of dimensions, etc., make funny assumptions. They assume that each passenger knows where they are in the airport, where they want to be in the airport, and what is the shortest route from where they are to where they want to be. I don't know if that matches your experience of airport travel. It does not match mine, and it also doesn't match the data that we've collected. So we've started designing agents that are more like humans, that somewhere in the middle of an intersection, make a little pause, scratch their head, and ask themselves, this way or that way. And obviously, if enough of these agents do this, stopping, scratching the head, and not knowing what to do, you get congestion, you get measures of them being unhappy, constrained, any of those things, right? I'll have more about real-world wayfinding experiments in a minute, and I don't think I really have time to go into spatial analysis into too much detail, but most types of spatial analysis, of which space syntax, which originates from University College London, is maybe the most prominent one. They all boil down to, you take a spatial layout, could be, this is city scale, so it could be a road network, metrically embedded, a map, right? Or you take the floor plan of the building, and you translate that metrically embedded information in something that's called a graph. So you look at all the spaces, all the elements that are of interest, and then you make a network of how far they are from one another. Not necessarily in terms of meters, right? But more in terms of how many other rooms do I have to move through to get from A to B? How many turns do I have to make? How many decisions do I have to make? So you're measuring cognitive distance between two spaces or 2 points in space, not metrically, but in terms of the cognitive effort of mentally getting from one place to another. And there's a whole series of conferences and papers and journals that deal with this kind of spatial analysis. And it turns out to be quite predictive of a lot of human behavior. To give you a bit more examples, so this is one of the underground spaces in one of the bigger shopping malls in Singapore. So this would be maybe on the 1 floor below or 2 floors below. And this illustrates, so this is a participant. They are wearing these funny looking glasses. These funny looking glasses have two infrared cameras that look at the movement of the eye relative to the frame, and have a camera here that makes a video of the scene around the person. And if you integrate those two pieces of information, you basically get a video recording of where people are looking in the space. There might be another person who is an experimenter who walks around, who eventually asks the participant questions about their experience, and who takes lots of notes. Psychologists always take notes, right? And you will look at stuff. This is an underground space that's connected to an underground regional train, so a subway connection, right? And you might ask questions about, okay, how difficult is it to navigate this space when it's not so crowded, and how difficult is it when there's tons of people and it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon and everybody wants to get home, right? Or you look at diverse demographics, older people, younger people. We've done some studies where we, by a local community center, got ourselves a hold of lots of 70-plus-year-old elderly ladies who have enough time in the afternoon to go and come to a study, right? And we walked with them through spaces like this and looked at how do they behave in this space? And how does that differ from getting a bunch of early 20s university students and inviting them into those spaces. What are their experiences? What do they struggle with, etc. We might look at people who have never been to this space and compare it to people who sometimes go to a space like this, but might also compare it to people who go there very often because they might be commuters who have to travel through this space regularly and who might find something is very easy. I mean, they know the route, right? But they might be more annoyed by certain things than other people because if you only go there once, something being ugly or inconvenient is, well, doesn't really matter. 5 minutes later, you forgot about it. If you have to go through this inconvenience every morning, maybe you have it has a different impact on you. And we do lots of analyses on these complex spatial configurations. So look at spaces that are confusing. And I'll have more to say about confusingness in a minute. This is another example. This is from Frankfurt Airport. Again, funny looking glasses with these cameras. And the orange circle, the orange donut illustrates where a person looks while they are trying to find the exit or the nearest connection to, I don't know, gate C27 or something like this. And this obviously is a video of a point in time where it's not so busy. And it turns out that this inconspicuous place is actually one of the choke points in Frankfurt Airport, because when in the morning at 7:30, all of these jets come in from Asia, they all land in the C terminal. This is in the middle of the C terminal. It gets so busy that everything is crowded with people and they all want to go to passport. They all want to go to their connecting flight. They all want to get their luggage. And so depending on how many people there are, this space functions in a fundamentally different way. Any questions until now? Like slides are always good for asking a question back to the audience.
Have you ever looked, when doing these experiments, not only different age groups, but also different genders specifically, and research into that?
And thank you for the question. Yes. So we do a bit less of that because there already is a lot of research on that. And the early answer from the research in the 60s, 70s, 80s was emphasizing the fact that men and women tend to, on average, differ in their preferred ways of dealing with space, right? The stereotype is that women get lost more easily than men. It turns out that in many of the things in gender studies, right, the variance, that there might be a difference between men and women on this. But like on almost anything gender related, the variance within the gender is bigger than the variance between the genders, right? So there's tons of guys who get a lot more lost than most women and vice versa, right? And for me as a psychologist, more interestingly, there's relatively little evidence that would say that this is genetic, right? Thus, physical sex related. It seems much more that it has a lot to do with people's self-confidence and their navigation abilities, right? So because if you ask male participants about how confident are you in your wayfinding, they tend to say, yay. And if you ask women, they tend to say, yay, a lot less often, right? And then you compare their actual behaviors. And it turns out that men tend to grossly overestimate their navigation abilities, and thus the differences are a lot smaller. Having said that, there still is quite a bit of research that suggests that for whatever reasons, and that those reasons might well be more cultural than anything else, there are some differences to be found. So typically, men are happy to rely more on a map-like representation, use a map or envision how things are related to one another in an integrated map-like stuff, like a floor plan, right? While women, on average, more often report that they memorize spaces as sequences of stuff they encounter, so in a route-based representation. Again, whether that is more cultural or not, right? Maybe more of the boys go to the Boy Scouts and spend more time with maps there, or and you can come up with any stereotype-based non-biological explanation here. There are differences. Coming to the absolute fundamental understanding of the nature of those gender differences is really difficult because ultimately you would have to do studies where you, for a very long period of time, put people into environments where none of those social factors have any influence, and good luck with getting that through an ethics committee. But it's a very good, so the spatial abilities and spatial behaviors are actually a really good example of where social components, maybe cognitive components, maybe to a tiny extent biological components come into play to explain differences in behavior and differences in perception. And yes, so there definitely are gender specific elements, and there's tons of people who are super interested in this. But in my personal experience, the differences are smaller than one would expect, and also smaller than they are often described in scientific studies. Does that fit to your question?
Yeah.
Excellent.
You see the same thing about height-based.
Can you elaborate on what you mean?
If a person is, for example, taller than another person, then they have a better overview of the space in general. If the space is, for example, like, I don't know, like a train station or something, but a taller person, for example, feels more restricted in, let's say, an older house where the ceilings are lower because they can't see that far, most likely, because the door frames are also lower. So they might be less able to navigate in a smaller room, at least in my experience.
Are you tall?
Well, I'm not tall, but like
You're sitting because that's why I can't judge.
here,
Okay.
for example, I went this, what was it, winter with my family to China, to Chongqing, one of the most densest cities in the world, right? And my mom and my sister were constantly lost in the city, right? Because they're the average height of the southern Chinese person. But I am taller than that, so I was constantly not that lost because I could see the signs and I could see where the flow of people was going because I was literally a head taller than them. So I had like an advantage in navigation there, I would say at least.
Yeah. I don't think that anybody has done systematic studies on this. I find it an intriguing topic. I don't know. Well, obviously it would be in line with what we know about spatial navigation and the role of visibility, right? There's this whole idea that if you can, wherever you are, see key points where you have to make a decision and can take those into account in your planning of movement, right? That then you would be better in navigating. And if one way of doing that is be taller than everybody else who's standing in the way, certainly that's true. And you're also absolutely correct. It should be the case that if the spatial arrangements are such that you are at a disadvantage as a taller person, like for example, if you are in a really old house where the door frames are lower, yes, your preview might be smaller compared to people who are at the average height of the people that people had when these buildings were designed. So yeah, good point. Yes, please.
I understand correctly, you research how people experience the space and how it's comfortable or not. I think the first example, the first part of your presentation dealt with like efficiency and how you won't get lost in buildings. How much of the physics of the building, for example, temperature or luminosity and stuff like that, do you take into account in your study? And
yes, yeah. Well, it really depends on the nature of the studies, right? So in this navigation related work, probably very little. I mean, yes, luminosity would be relevant because if it's dark, you bump your head, right? And even relative luminosity, right? So a space that you are approaching that is lighter is probably more inviting than a space that is darker, right? So that at least on a subconscious level would have an impact, and that's also quite well documented both in architecture theory and in the empirical literature. But when it comes to these other things like interaction qualities, how do people spend time together? How calming is a space? How stress-inducing is a space? Those kind of questions. Then these other elements come in, right? So CO2 level in the room has every once in a while we have to crack a window and get some fresh air in, right? So We've done, not my team, but other teams in our center have done research on CO2 levels and creativity or ability to focus on work, etc. Right, and has an impact. And the same is true of light. There's a big area of research on color, the impact of color on well-being, etc. While some of that strikes me still as a bit speculative, so this whole thing on green induces this and blue induces this and yellow induces this, I'm not so sure if it holds as much as the other colleagues feel it does. I am quite confident that there is a strong cultural component in what meaning people associate with different colors, right? If only you look at how cultures differ and how they interpret colors like white or red, right, in terms of positive and negative associations. Yeah, I think that would be mostly my answer. Good. Let me show you a few more things, and thank you for those questions. So, I'm not going to go into detail on this specifically, but just introduce some terminology because we will have that as one of the readings in 2 weeks' time. This is supposed to be a bit of a cognitive model or scientific model of the relation between wayfinding and the human properties and building properties, right? And the question you had about gender actually fits right now in here, namely under this label of the cognitive map. What is a cognitive map? A cognitive map is not a physical map. It is the representation in your mind, in your head, that you make when you explore spaces over time and when you memorize the relation of those spaces relative to one another. This is often described as a map-like representation. This map in your head is not physically, not like a physical map. It does not retain all the metric relations that you would have in a properly scaled physical map. It's probably a lot more like a network of connections and distances and is subject to certain kinds of distortions. But it's clear that if you are to navigate in a building, having an understanding of the structure of the building will be very useful, and you build such a representation over time. And yes, there are some gender differences there. There clearly are properties of a building, right? So the complexity of the building will have an impact. Whether it has many subspaces, whether you can see everything at the same time, right? Or whether you have to, like in a maze, make lots of arbitrary choices between corridors that all look the same, and that might lead you to literally nowhere, namely into a dead end and a cul-de-sac, right? This is what's captured here. This idea that the complexity or the difficulty of a building has to do with its layout complexity, has to do with architectural differentiation, which is a fancy word of saying how similar or different spaces in a building look like. And clearly, in more traditional architecture, you might have more detailed articulation and more spaces that do not look similar to one another. While one of the beauties of modernist architecture is that things often look a lot the same, and that can sometimes be confusing. Signage clearly is an element of orientation. And visual access, this idea of what can you see? What are visual connections to key information points, doors, corridors, etc. That would be the architecture side. And then the human side is clearly how well can you memorize space? How well can you build a relevant mental representation of how space is organized? But also things that differ between people. What kind of strategies do they have, right? How much do they rely on this map-like representation? How much do they try to memorize sequences and retrace their route and those kind of things? And there are individual differences in people's competence in space. There probably is, like on anything that has to do with intelligence, some genetic component and a very strong component of experience, right? So spending a lot of time moving around certain types of spaces probably makes you more competent to navigate in those spaces than others. And then with a framing like this, we go and plan our case studies on experiments to find out, okay, what of this is it that drives whether a building works well or not so well? And one example where we've done quite a bit on this is the Seattle Central Library. the Seattle Central Library. My colleague Gustav and I have also done an edited book, which is for a workbook for students on various scientific and architectural stances and perspectives on analyzing the Seattle Central Library. It's a Rem Koolhaas building. It has won all sorts of prizes and all sorts of criticism. I have a few more slides about this, so maybe I can make that point more, yeah. So this is the nice view of it, pretending that Seattle has good weather, which most of the time is not true. It much more looks like this. But we can definitely agree it's an unusual building. It's maybe an interesting building. It is a building that has sculptural quality from the outside, and it's done by a brand name architect, right? On the outside, it's like a sculpture, but this sculpture also translates into how it is on the inside. Because if it looks like this, one of the consequences is that the floors inside the building will look very different because they will have different shapes and they will not be on top of one another, but they will be slightly offset because that's how the sculpture works, right? And then if people navigate in there, maybe, just maybe, the fact that you are here, but you think you're here might make it confusing if the mode of transport between floors that you're using is an elevator, and elevators tend to go up and not sideways, right? So these kinds of elements of cognitive mapping. And here's one of my favorite quotes that I always use if I have to vindicate why we're doing this research, and therefore I'm going to read it to you. The wayfinding wasn't done perfectly, to put it kindly. When you understand the building, it is very simple, just a series of boxes. But what we didn't understand is, to the uninitiated person, someone not an architect or a library staffer, it can be complex if they don't understand that. What we thought is blatantly obvious isn't. And this is what, in retrospect, Joshua Prince-Ramus says, who at the time was the leading architect on this Koolhaas project. And then in this logic, we then look at our experiments. We did a study looking at social media responses to the building, and one of my favorite here is, I found the ever-narrowing floating escalators, this is an example, to be frightening and left the building as soon as I could figure out how to get out, hoping I wouldn't have an anxiety attack first. So this illustrates that such a perspective is not necessarily only about efficiency, right? It is also about the emotional response that people have to this space. Because there are some subspaces in this building that are fantastic. They are sociable. You can sit there, you can talk there. They're part of this library where you're allowed to talk with other people. There's a coffee shop and all that, right? But then there's narrow escalators. And funnily enough, there's this escalator goes up. There is no escalator down. So once you're up at the top, you have to find a different way of getting down again. You can take a winding staircase that you walk down, but there is no obvious equivalent to the way up, right? So I'm sure we don't have to do a study even to figure out that that might be confusing to some people. But we did this study anyway. Not going to go into too much detail here, but this just illustrates we would have a starting location and a destination location. And we would look at the visibility, how much can you see from where you're starting your task and from where you would end your task, and then analyze how many other spaces, how many turns do you have to make to get from A to B. We would also look at whether the locations or the functions are where people might expect it, or if they're a bit unusually located. Right? Taking into account people's expectations, people's knowledge about libraries. And then we did 2 studies. And in those studies, we followed people around. May I need a Prof? Sure. Imagine this is an iPad. This would be an iPad. We would have a note-taking person walking behind and tracing digitally the routes of everybody in the building. And we would aggregate this all in database, and then you get a representation like this. And the color coding here is where are many of the routes and where are fewer of the routes. And of course, you then have to separate that into the different tasks that people had. And then you can analyze and pinpoint, okay, what's going wrong? And I think I have one example here. One example is find the section with the non-fiction DVDs, right? So where are the documentaries, right? Where would you find those? And we had people start at a very central location where there's lots of options and where it's not really far to where you have to go. You only have to go, I think, 2 floors up on this yellow escalator, get off, walk a few meters, and this is where the DVDs are, right? So you're already here, you have to get on an escalator here, you have to walk, get on an escalator, and then it's right there. But what you see here is if people knew what they were doing, all those traces should be pretty much like the dotted line, right? And maybe there were 1 or 2 of our 40 participants that did that, but most of them did something else. They were looking for DVDs in the basement. They were looking for DVDs further up. They got lost. And the moment you really get lost in a building like this, then you are lost. Then you need a lot of time to retrace your step, maybe go back to where you started and try different options out. And funnily enough, they would even, if they looked at the main information board, there would even be information about nonfiction DVDs are on, I'm saying, floor number 5, and they could have easily navigated there. But people have their expectations, people follow their nose through the building, and then given the relatively complex layouts of this building, they do get lost. And this is just one example, and there's a lot more. And of course, you can ask, why is this, right? I mean, it's often said that there are certain types of spaces where you confuse people deliberately, right? So if you run a casino, you want people to get into the casino and then to forget that the outside world exists, and you want them to gamble until you've bled them dry, and then you're happy to escort them out if needed, right? But you definitely don't want them to leave again. You want them to just stay in there, and a lot of the layouts of places like this, and that to some extent also is true of amusement parks, are about keeping people in and not giving people efficient navigation. You could now, of course, also argue that maybe Koolhaas wanted this library to be a place where you get lost so that you get exposed while you're walking around to more books, right? That would be a nice theory, but I don't think that's what it is. There probably is a component of they had to do a beautiful sculpture. They had to deliver a building that is in line with the expectations of brand name architecture, right? But it's also the case, and that led them to making maybe some quirky choices, and that led to some considerations. But it's also the case that a library, especially a library that's supposed to be a library, a social space, a multimedia space, have seminar rooms and an auditorium, is actually not a very homogeneous space. And although a large chunk of this library has a big atrium, which seemingly allows you to see everything, the actual navigation part of the building is removed from that atrium. And when you are at those points where you have to choose, this way or that way, you very often see very little of the relevant information in the building. And that probably is a large chunk of the explanation for the navigation difficulties. And I invite you, obviously, to look deeper into the kind of research that's done on this. A few more minutes. I'll show you a very different example. So this was proper architecture. I'll now show you some architecture that's really easy to hate. It's a conference center in Güne am Möhnesee. This is in Germany, as highlighted by the beautiful umlauts in the name. And it's a conference center in the countryside, on a lake, in the middle of nowhere. And by the way, quite close to where the next Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany is coming from, in the Sauerland. And so this is a 1970s building, I think completed in 1971. And it's super confusing. It has lots of hexagonal segments. It has corridors that require zigzagging back and forth. And this is the main space. Well, this is a virtual reality replica of a canonical view of the most central space in the building. And I'm not going to argue beauty here, but yes, you see a staircase here, you see another door there, but you don't really get a good sense of what the building is about from being at this entrance-like most central space of the building, right? So we've done a couple of experiments in this building. Why in this building of all buildings? Well, A, because early 70s, architecture is notoriously difficult for navigation and wayfinding, and there's tons of it around in Germany. And before joining ETH, I was at German universities. And B, because every year there's a cognitive science summer school in this building. So every year we have about 150 volunteers that we can test and see how they behave in the space. And after doing a lot of experiments, we decided to test out some hypothetical architectural interventions, right? And this is a multi-level building where all the floors have slightly different layouts again. And one intervention that one could do would be to, in the main hall of or the main entrance area of the building, cut in a huge atrium. You are architects and you will all agree that this is not necessarily an artistically convincing intervention into the building, but in terms of providing visual access in the building, it clearly provides visual access and provides an understanding that this is a multi-level space where you have different ways of access. It gives you preview, gives you some understanding of how the rest of the building will operate. And so we got ourselves these virtual reality replicas. This is 10 years ago, virtual reality. This is why it's so maybe not convincing in terms of its graphics. And what we did is we did a study where we gave people in the real building navigation tasks of which we assumed they would be sensitive to whether or not you have this preview that these architectural interventions would generate. So we did a real world experiment on the real building. We then redid this experiment with new participants in virtual reality, not in the conference center, but just at the university location, right? And then we got a third group of participants and made them navigate in the updated version of the building. And the one with where the atrium is open, where some of the other staircases are better aligned so that you have better visibility and things just make more sense, right? And what we find is that and this is again a tracing of the routes. And what we find is that while on average, the large movement patterns in terms of people exploring the building, etc., remain relatively similar, when it comes to those tasks where we thought, well, finding this specific destination, like this room or the cafeteria or the swimming pool, right? That where we thought that people would differ depending on whether there is this architectural intervention or not. We found the differences, and also we found a sufficiently convincing similarity between how people behave in the real building and how they believe in the virtual reality replica. Because you could also wonder whether virtual reality is enough to capture really how spaces are. And obviously on some level they are not, right? So virtual reality does not have the materiality of real spaces, right? How the surface feels, how the light reflects on the wall. Certain kinds of things are not the same in virtual reality. Also, given that you have this thing on your head and that you know there's a psychologist sitting next to you and you've just been invited into an experiment, is clearly not the same as hanging out in a conference center or trying to catch your flight at the airport. And therefore, it's important for us that we don't try to argue that, oh, the data that we observe in virtual reality shows us exactly how people will behave. What we try to do is compare things in virtual reality, different options, and then see which of those have certain differences in the effect. And in this case, when there is also a real space, we try to compare with the real space to get a sense of how much of a distortion, how much of a mismatch, the fact that you're seeing this virtually rather than experience it in reality makes for you. Let me highlight another study that's currently ongoing. And just to give you a glimpse of another method that we're using to collect data. This is in Zurich University Hospital at the emergency department. Yuchen, I believe you've been there earlier today, right? Very good. And here we did a study together with the people running the hospital. And we want to find out how the spatial arrangement in the emergency department impacts how people move. and how and where they communicate when they're doing certain tasks, like the staff, like the nurses and doctors. Where do they meet? Where do they go when they have to work on themselves? Where do they go to catch somebody else for information? Where do they exchange? Where do they have face-to-face interactions? And where do they not? And is it in the way that it is intended by the people running this place, how they want it to be done? And one way of doing this is that we equip every participant who volunteers to be in the study, give them this little tag, which is basically a battery-operated radio frequency identification tag, and we put tags in the environment, and these tags continuously record the presence of other tags. So over the course of the day or the week, it gives you a measurement of how many people have been where the stationary tags are. So it gives you a sense of occupancy, right? But also when two people meet, the tags exchange information about having met, right? And so you get a sense of who meets how many people and where do they meet, because you have the information about the fixed tags in the space, the spatial embedding, and the navigation and interaction patterns, right? And it turns out that some spatial measures that are about visibility, like the visibility field around spaces, is highly predictive of where people would meet and where people would stop to exchange information and where they find these interactions to be positive or negatively experienced, right? And then there is the Swiss Center for the Design and Health, which is a competence center of the Swiss government. And they do a lot of great things. They're sitting in an old industrial facility in Nidau, which is in a suburb of Biel, which is in the canton of Bern. And since this is Switzerland, it's located on a beautiful lake. And in this facility, they, among other things, have this space, which is, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 basketball courts large. And they have high luminance, high resolution, high-speed projection systems so that you can project any kind of space, any kind of layout onto this floor. And then we invite people to do role-playing exercises. To facilitate this, in this particular case, we also put up these dividing walls that represent the walls in the existing emergency department, because luckily enough, the main part of University Hospital Zurich emergency department nicely fits exactly into that projection space. And then we do exercises where some people are the doctors and some are the nurses and some are the patients. And then we maybe, for discussion purposes, like illustrated here, project spatial analysis on the floor, saying something about connectivity, visibility, and other properties. And I think there's a video here even. Let's look at the video. The music is terrible. Right, so we invite people, we have these conversations, we show them around, we explain to them the game, we show them some information for discussion purposes about the spatial analysis, and then we elicit responses from the various stakeholders. We also have a version, I'm not sure if this is in the video, where we have these agent-based simulations of nurses and doctors and how they run around and where they would meet. And we can use this to verify our observations, to get stakeholder feedback, right? A bit like participatory design, although maybe not the most straightforward version of participatory design, a feedback loop to find out if the kind of data that we collect in this kind of spatial setting is useful. And obviously, you wouldn't do this exercise just to confirm that the way that the emergency department at University Hospital Zurich is structured is optimal. It never is optimal, but it works quite reasonably. But this is actually a quite current example because University Hospital now gets this fantastic new huge block in the back. One of Switzerland's biggest construction sites right now. And they will get a fantastic new 4 times larger emergency department. And there's lots of discussion on what is the optimized layout, which becomes quite relevant when your space becomes really large, and thus navigation and optimizing people and information flows becomes more of a concern. I'll close off in the next few minutes by giving you a few more reflections on reflective research and on translational research. So remember, I now talked a lot about end users, about people in spaces and how they perceive and deal with these spaces. Remember, reflective research was more the questions that we have about designers and this anticipatory relation here. So looking at how well do designers anticipate user needs and behaviors? How do architects use different types of available evidence about end users? And what information or knowledge do designers need, right? And there we do, again, psychology stuff, surveys, interviews, literature review, but also secondments to practice, so going into architecture offices and doing workshops with practitioners. And one example here is an industrial secondment to UN Studio, and I can tell you a lot about it, but Yuchen is in the room, and Yuchen, why don't you say a few things about your experience with UN Studio?
I'm not going to stand with like this.
That's fine.
But yeah, so I had this fantastic experience with UN Studio. It was the whole project itself. It's a year-long project with them. But among the whole time, I have this 1 month that I get to stay in the office and work with the architects directly. And this is two different aspects. One aspect is that I try to bring, let's say, behavioral, cognitive related knowledge into the practice during their design processes, doing sharing with them, and as you can see, holding workshop with the designers, introducing different concepts that is more human-centric and more quantitative, and then methodologies in spatial analysis, etc. So this is one part, but the other part is also to learn from the architects, which means I do interviews and also observational studies with them to see what is their actual design process like and how can we in the future better integrate such human-centric evidence-based design knowledge into the design process. Yeah, so.
And why don't you also talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so this is about the cognitive cards. So maybe we have a chance to do an activity during this class as well. So this is a set of spatial cognition thinking cards plus architectural design strategy cards. So one part of it is to mainly introduce spatial cognition related knowledge and concepts to the let's say I think mainly architects or agencies, stakeholders, etc., to introduce the more researcher knowledge to the actual practitioners. And the other set, the architecture design strategy class, is more for brainstorming and design generation, conceptual generation for the architects as well. And then through this process of discussing with the stakeholders and the designers, we as researchers also learn the way that how they perceive things differently. Like one example being that when I was discussing with the UN Studio architects, some of the concepts that they have learned about, and then when I asked them about certain case studies, and then I would say how they perceive certain spatial cognition related concepts is actually quite different from how researchers perceive it. So finding out this difference is also quite interesting. Yes.
Thank you, Jim. Very good. So this is obviously already transitioning over to translational research, where we ask what of the things that we do can be useful in informing architectural designers. We've done this is one example, and we've done different kinds of projects. Again, an example from Singapore here is work with the Land Transport Authority, so one of the Singapore government agencies responsible for outdoor or urban level environments. And what we're doing there is help the Singapore government and various companies that do the design of these things come up with better map-based orientation support in urban environments, especially for guiding tourists in busy places. And what we do is we go out and we do interviews with people about how do you navigate in the city, where do you get lost, those kind of things. where we do stuff that's called user shadowing. So you follow people around in a non-conspicuous way and without getting into a fight, obviously, to see what are typical navigation patterns, where do people seem confused, etc. We do testing of maps. We compare different versions of maps. We first do that in the laboratory, again with eye tracking, to see how quickly people can find, for example, their own location on a map, find a destination, plan their route, etc. Then we do wayfinding experiments in the real environment, including mobile eye tracking, again, to look at how much time do people spend navigating with the map, how much time do people spend looking around in the environment. And then this is not depicted here. In the meantime, the Land Transport Authority with its partners has implemented some of those navigation support systems. Some of that is giving out paper maps. But more importantly, they've also put up these columns. Means maybe you are familiar with the wayfinding system that's been put up in central London in the last decade and a half, where in touristy spaces in the central districts, there's now these columns on the street corners, etc., where there's maps that are designed much better than the traditional map would have been. Maps that are at the right scale, that highlight certain kinds of destinations, that are always rotated in such a way that you don't have to mentally rotate the map, but can just project the map as lying in front of you, and using lots of color and simplifications to allow for easier navigation. And that's basically what was also the aim of this design project. And we're now finishing off a phase where we are validating whether these things really work in the built environment when they're implemented in Singapore. And so far, things on that are looking really good. Those would have been the examples from Singapore that I brought. And I know we should end quickly, but I want to show you one example. One example that I'm proud of for different reasons. One is really nice publications in reasonable journals, right? And we'll happily share that with you. But also a simple case study. So this building here is the most cube-like cube box that you can get. It exists not very far from Grüne am Möhnesee. It exists in Essen at Zecher-Zollverein, and it's a Sana building. It has a lot of qualities, but it has its own Wikipedia page talking about how bad the usability of that building is, right? And I mean, Dada have done amazing work. They continue to do amazing work. Think of the Rolex Center at our sister university in Lausanne, right? But this block did not work in its original function as an educational facility, and now it has been repurposed and is being used as an office, because office spaces are a bit more flexible and have fewer constraints in terms of orientation, navigation, etc. And so we took this Sana building, got ourselves a 3D model of that building, populated it with furniture, etc. And then we did a couple of experiments. We did agent-based simulation experiments where we just put our little agent and let them roam around, right? But we also did a virtual reality experiment where we invited volunteers to navigate through this building. And we did the original building, then a version where, picking up this idea of visibility and across floor visibility, our colleagues cut in quite a few atrium-like spaces between the floors so that you would get some preview, right? Quite a nice idea, right? That's one, but the other, more important, maybe more important in the variation, is that these are the two main navigation cores, the staircases, right? And in the original building, there's very little visibility because they are mostly enclosed and separate from the rest of the space. A bit like if you go to HIT building, right? A nice, easy to see building, huge atrium, everything is clear, right? But the moment you navigate from one floor to the other, you get away from the atrium, you have to get into the staircase, right? You have no more visibility. You have no more sense of how many floors do I have to walk, etc. And then you get spit out again. And again, HIT building is a fantastic building, probably done by an ETH professor as main architect, right? But in terms of navigation, not so great. So the intervention here is to put glass around the main staircases. And the question is, does this change how people navigate? our agent-based simulation suggested that it should, right? Because if I design agents that go via visibility, they will have an easier time in the glass version than in one where I reasonably but not connected to the vertical connections cut in atria, and definitely in comparison to how Sana architects designed the building in the first place. And this is a little video. Does this one by itself? It doesn't. Right, so virtual reality experiment, and this is, I hope none of you gets motion sick now. Right, this is moving through the space. And they have these different tasks, and then they walk around. And I think now we've seen it, it just loops. So this gives you an illustration of the kind of veridicality of this virtual reality model. Obviously, the whole building is represented in a fairly abstract fashion, but then again, it is a fairly concrete-driven building style. And then we did all sorts of analyses, and I'll point you to the paper where it explains all of that, and we find clear differences depending on where people want to go. There are certain destinations that are more obvious than others, and we find that for certain destinations, depending on people's expectations, the different interventions are differently helpful, right? For some tasks, this atrium opening helps a lot, but what seems to really make a difference across the board is to increase visibility via this glass intervention, where you increase the visibility of the staircases and the visibility from the staircases, and it invites people to more often do vertical navigation and to more quickly get to the target floor, and then also more quickly to find where they have to go, because this glass intervention gives you both visibility of inviting navigation, but also gives you a preview of what you can do next once you are reaching your target floor. And I'll skip the details. But what we find here, for example, in the original, people walk around in a certain fashion again, and it's quite distributed. Cutting in atria makes some difference, so it's not exactly the same patterns, but overall, if you aggregate across those 6 different navigation tasks, still fairly similar to the original. But when you have the glass intervention, then there's less inefficient wandering around. There's more gravitation to the main staircases, and presumably because people, while they're navigating through the glass staircases, have a better preview and a better sense of the structure of the building, they then have more efficient routes actually getting to the final destination. And thus visibility combined with what people expect about the building, how they learn about the building, seems to be a very good predictor of people's behavior in that space. And more statistics and more statistics. And what also comes out is that there's different modes of how people predominantly navigate. There's people, we call them cluster 0, that navigate more at the outskirts of the building, more go around like a cat would if you place it in a new room that the cat hasn't been in before. So walking around the perimeter to get a sense of the building overall, while certain people, and especially in the glass condition, a different strategy is triggered, namely one that is less at the periphery of the building, but focuses really more in its movement in the central parts of the building, where, of course, most of the connection and most of the movement and discovery potential in this building is. And I think I might as well stop on this slide. Thank you very much.